On April 3rd, 2026, two American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers were already hours into a 36-hour round-trip flight from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri when new intelligence came in that changed the entire mission. A large number of senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders had gathered inside a hardened underground bunker near Tehran, a facility built specifically to survive exactly the kind of attack that was about to hit it. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of U.S. Central Command, made the call almost immediately, weighing the risk of diverting already committed assets against the value of a target that might never present itself again in such a concentrated, vulnerable form. The bombers adjusted course, armed their payload, and dropped GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs, directly onto that underground command center. According to the Wall Street Journal, the facility was completely obliterated, and several Revolutionary Guard commanders were killed in the strike. One senior military source put it bluntly to Fox News afterward, saying they hit the IRGC exactly where it hurts the most. That's not a hypothetical scenario or a future threat sitting somewhere on a planning document. That actually happened, and it's one of the clearest demonstrations we've seen of just how far the United States is willing to go and how deep it's willing to reach to dismantle Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure piece by piece. So let's break down exactly what this bomb is, what happened that night, and why this single strike tells you almost everything you need to know about where this entire war is headed. If you want to keep following this conflict as it develops, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more coming. And once you've made it through this, drop a comment and let me know what you think the next major target looks like, because I want to hear your take. Let's start with what actually makes the GBU-57 such a uniquely terrifying weapon in the first place, because this isn't just a bigger version of a normal bomb. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator weighs roughly 30,000 pounds, stretches about 20.5 feet long, and is designed to do something almost no other conventional weapon on Earth can do: punch through more than 200 feet of packed earth or around 60 feet of reinforced concrete before it actually detonates. Most bombs explode on impact, or close to it. This one is built to survive the impact completely intact, continue driving downward through rock and concrete using pure kinetic force, and only trigger its warhead once it's reached the depth where the target actually lives. It's the difference between throwing a rock at a window and firing a drill bit through a wall. One shatters on the surface, the other is engineered specifically to keep going regardless of what stands in its way. And there's only one aircraft in the entire American arsenal cleared to carry it into combat, the B-2 Spirit, a stealth bomber that can slip into heavily defended airspace essentially undetected, deliver a payload capable of collapsing a mountain's worth of hardened infrastructure, and then fly home without ever needing to land anywhere near the fight. The IRGC headquarters strike in early April wasn't the first time this weapon had been used in this specific conflict either, and understanding the timeline actually helps explain why Iran was building bunkers this deep in the first place. Go back to June of last year, to an operation the Pentagon named Midnight Hammer, when 7 B-2 bombers flew a coordinated mission and dropped a total of 14 GBU-57 bombs onto Iran's Fordow and Natanz nuclear facilities, with more than 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles hitting auxiliary infrastructure at Isfahan at the same time. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, personally confirmed the details at a Pentagon briefing afterward, and satellite imagery released in the following days showed exactly what that kind of firepower does to a mountainside. Large craters, gray ash scattered across the terrain, and multiple precise penetration points where the bombs had punched through the surface before detonating deep underground. That operation was the combat debut of this weapon. 15 years in development specifically because planners understood that a facility like Fordow, built deep enough into a mountain to be effectively immune to anything smaller, needed a bomb engineered from scratch just to have a chance of reaching it. It's worth slowing down on that Midnight Hammer mission for a second, because the sheer scale of the operation tells you a lot about how seriously the Pentagon treated the challenge of actually reaching Fordow in the first place. More than 125 aircraft and roughly 4,000 personnel were involved in that single operation, with strike packages launched from bases across multiple continents, all coordinated around the arrival of 7 B-2 Spirit bombers over Iranian airspace. It wasn't just about the bombers themselves either. The mission required an entire supporting architecture: fighter sweeps to clear the skies, suppression assets to neutralize any radar systems that might detect the incoming aircraft, and deception tactics designed to mask the true nature of the mission until the very last possible moment. That's the real value of a weapon. Like the GBU-57, it's never really just about the bomb itself. It's about the entire chain of intelligence, stealth aviation, and battlefield suppression required to get that bomb to the exact right spot without losing the aircraft carrying it. People sometimes compare the GBU-57 to the Moab, the enormous 10,000-pound bomb used in Afghanistan years ago, but the comparison actually misses the point of what makes this weapon unique. The Moab was built as a massive general-purpose blast weapon designed to create an enormous surface explosion. The GBU-57, despite being 3 times heavier, isn't really about the size of the blast at all. It's about penetration, about surviving the impact completely intact, so it can keep driving downward before it ever goes off. One is built to flatten what's above ground. The other is built specifically to reach what's buried below it. What's important to understand is that Iran didn't just absorb that damage and move on quietly. They adapted, and they adapted fast. Within months, satellite imagery started showing something analysts had specifically warned about: Iran hardening its remaining nuclear-adjacent sites in direct anticipation of future strikes. Take Taleghan 2, a facility tied to Iran's nuclear program that had been getting relatively little attention compared to the bigger names like Fordow and Natanz. By March of this year, satellite images from the firm Vantor showed the site had been reinforced with a fresh concrete shell and then buried under a layer of soil, a deliberate hardening effort in the months leading up to renewed strikes. When American and Israeli forces eventually hit it, post-strike imagery revealed 3 large, precisely placed impact points on the surface, the unmistakable signature of very heavy bunker-busting weapons. Analysts noted this exact pattern, hardening a site right before it gets struck. Had shown up before Midnight Hammer as well, which tells you Iran has been operating on a fairly consistent assumption throughout this entire war, that no matter how many layers of concrete and soil it piles on top of a facility, eventually American intelligence finds it, and eventually American bombers reach it anyway. That brings us back to the strike on the IRGC's underground headquarters near Tehran, because the story behind it is genuinely one of the more dramatic sequences of this entire conflict. The mission was part of a much larger operation happening simultaneously that night: the rescue of 2 downed F-15E crew members deep inside Iranian territory. While that recovery effort was underway, U.S. Air Force B-1 bombers, call sign Bones, dropped roughly 100 2,000-pound bombs around the rescue area with one specific purpose: keeping Iranian forces away from the crew members long enough for the recovery to succeed. In the middle of that operation, CENTCOM received sensitive, time-critical intelligence indicating exactly where a significant concentration of senior IRGC commanders had gathered underground. Admiral Cooper made the decision on the spot to redirect the B-2s already in the air toward that target, threading a strike on a hardened leadership bunker directly into the middle of an active personnel recovery mission. Open-source analysts have since suggested the facility may have been located in the mountainous Jamaran district in northern Tehran, though that specific location has never been officially confirmed by the U.S. government. What has been confirmed is that the strike happened between the 2 separate rescue operations that night, after the first and before the second, meaning American forces were simultaneously protecting downed airmen and eliminating a senior enemy command structure in the same compressed window of time, using 2 entirely different categories of aircraft and munitions working in perfect coordination. President Trump commented on the successful rescue afterward on social media, describing the extraction of what he called a seriously wounded and really brave F-15 crew member from deep inside the mountains of Iran, and noting just how rare and dangerous that kind of raid actually is. It's worth sitting with that combination for a second, because it captures something important about how this war has actually been fought. This wasn't a distant, impersonal bombing campaign happening from 30,000 feet with no human stakes attached. It was a night where American pilots were shot down deep inside hostile territory, where other American aircrews risked their own lives flying back in to get them out, and where, in the middle of all of that chaos and danger, military planners still found the intelligence window to eliminate a hardened enemy command bunker using the single most powerful conventional weapon in the entire American arsenal. That's the kind of operational complexity that doesn't happen by accident. It requires exactly the fusion of stealth aviation, real-time intelligence, and specialized munitions that this specific mission ended up demonstrating in the clearest possible terms. Iran's own response to that strike near Tehran followed a pattern that's become fairly predictable throughout this war. Regime officials publicly downplayed the extent of the damage, framing the loss as manageable, while privately, according to multiple intelligence assessments, scrambling to reconstitute command structures and disperse remaining leadership across a wider network of locations, specifically to avoid presenting another concentrated target like the one that had just been destroyed. State media largely avoided direct acknowledgement of how many senior commanders had actually been lost in the strike, a pattern of information control that's shown up repeatedly whenever this war has delivered a result Tehran didn't want broadcast widely to its own population. That instinct to obscure rather than confirm losses tells you something important about how this regime manages pressure internally, treating transparency about battlefield setbacks as almost as dangerous as the setbacks themselves, since an accurate accounting of how deep American weapons can actually reach might do serious damage to the regime's own narrative of resilience and control. It's a pattern that's repeated after nearly every major strike of this war. official silence or minimization in the first hours, followed days or weeks later by independent satellite imagery and outside analysis that ends up painting a far more damaging picture than anything Tehran was willing to admit on its own state broadcasts. This strike happened as part of a much larger campaign called Operation Epic Fury, the joint American and Israeli military effort against Iran that officially began on February 28th of this year. By the time this bunker strike happened in early April, that operation had already reportedly neutralized more than 5,000 Iranian targets and degraded roughly 90% of the country's missile production and storage capability. And on that same day, Trump reportedly issued Iran a 24-hour ultimatum warning that the country would face devastating consequences if it didn't return to serious negotiations, going so far as to say the entire nation could face a single night of destruction unlike anything it had experienced before. So this wasn't an isolated event happening in a vacuum. It was one specific, highly dramatic data point inside a much larger, sustained campaign that had already been grinding through Iranian military infrastructure for over a month at that point. A campaign that would go on to expand further into strikes on bridges, power plants, coastal defenses, and eventually the deeply buried nuclear sites that remain the most difficult targets of the entire war. Think about it almost like an arms race playing out entirely underground, invisible to satellites except for the faint traces of excavation and construction that give away where the digging is happening. Every time Iran adds another layer of concrete, buries an entrance a little deeper, or chooses a harder type of rock for a new facility, it's essentially raising the ante in a contest where the only way to know who's actually winning is to wait for the next strike and see what's left standing afterward. And every time the United States successfully reaches one of those hardened sites, whether it's Fordow, Taleghan 2, or that underground bunker near Tehran, it resets the baseline for what depth and hardening can actually be expected to accomplish, forcing Iranian planners back to the drawing board to figure out what, if anything, might work better next time. That's an expensive, slow-moving contest for both sides, but it's one where Iran is fundamentally playing defense, spending enormous resources trying to protect infrastructure it can't move, while the United States only needs to succeed once against any given target to eliminate whatever advantage all that hardening was supposed to provide. Let's talk for a moment about why this particular weapon matters so much strategically. Because the GBU-57 isn't just a bigger bomb, it represents a specific kind of message that conventional airstrikes simply can't send on their own. For decades, adversarial governments around the world have operated on a fairly simple assumption that if you bury something deep enough underground, surround it with enough reinforced concrete, and build it into solid rock rather than open ground, you create infrastructure that can survive almost anything short of a nuclear weapon. Iran built an enormous amount of its most sensitive military and nuclear infrastructure around exactly that assumption. Command bunkers, missile storage facilities, and enrichment sites were all designed with the explicit goal of outlasting an air campaign, giving the regime leadership and its most critical assets a level of survivability that ordinary buildings simply don't have. The GBU-57 exists specifically to prove that assumption wrong. It's the physical answer to decades of hardened, deeply buried construction. A weapon developed with the sole purpose of reaching the exact places military planners around the world have spent billions of dollars trying to make unreachable. And that's precisely why the replenishment of this weapon has become such a significant story in its own right over the past several months. After Midnight Hammer expended 14 of these bombs in a single operation, the U.S. Air Force moved almost immediately to restock its inventory, awarding Boeing, the only qualified manufacturer of this specific munition, a sole source contract to produce additional units. By February of this year, that contract had grown into a package worth more than $100 million, covering new tail kits, fuse system components, and all the specialized hardware needed to turn the 30,000-pound penetrator into a fully field-ready weapon. Air Force officials were explicit in their justification notice, warning that any delay in this contracting process would directly undermine operational readiness for exactly the kind of strategic contingency planning this war has now put to the test in real time. This is a genuinely low-density weapon, meaning there simply aren't very many of them sitting in inventory at any given moment, which makes every single operational use of it, including the strike near Tehran in April, a meaningful drawdown of a strategic capability that takes real time and real money to rebuild. There's also a longer-term piece to this story that's worth understanding, because the Pentagon isn't just replenishing what it already has, it's actively working on what comes next. Following the combat debut of the GBU-57 during Midnight Hammer, the Air Force accelerated development of what's being called the Next Generation Penetrator, a new bunker-busting weapon being developed in close collaboration with Boeing, the same company behind the original MOP. Budget documents show more than $100 million allocated toward that development effort, with design requirements calling for extraordinary precision, striking within roughly 7 feet of a designated target at least 90% of the time, even in environments where GPS signals are degraded or actively jammed. The current B-2 fleet and the newer B-21 Raider are both being considered as potential carriers for this next-generation weapon, though the smaller B-21 would likely only be able to carry a single unit per mission compared to the B-2's capacity for two. All of this tells you something important about how seriously this specific category of warfare is being taken at the highest levels of American military planning. This isn't a one-time weapon built for a single campaign. It's becoming a permanent, evolving pillar of how the United States plans to deal with hardened, deeply buried targets anywhere in the world, and Iran's underground infrastructure has effectively become the real-world proving ground for that entire doctrine. Every lesson learned from Fordow, from Taleghan 2, and from that bunker near Tehran feeds directly back into how the next-generation penetrator gets designed, tested, and eventually fielded. Which means the strikes happening in this war right now are quite literally shaping the weapons that future American administrations will rely on decades from now, long after this specific conflict has been resolved one way or another. There's a wider regional dimension worth folding into this story too, because a strike this significant never stays contained to just the two countries directly involved. Israel, which has fought alongside the United States throughout Operation Epic Fury since its launch in late February, doesn't actually possess the GBU-57 or the B-2 bombers needed to deliver it, which has made this specific weapon something of a uniquely American contribution to the broader joint campaign. Israeli officials have been vocal about welcoming exactly this kind of deep strike capability, arguing consistently that leaving any hardened Iranian command or nuclear infrastructure intact represents an unacceptable long-term risk, regardless of how difficult or expensive it is to actually neutralize. Gulf states, positioned closer to the fighting, have watched each of these strikes with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that Iran's capacity to threaten the region keeps getting degraded, and anxiety over exactly how Tehran might choose to retaliate against nearby targets that have far less protection than a heavily defended American bomber flying at altitude. And further away, countries like Russia and China have been closely studying the technical performance of this weapon for entirely different reasons, treating every strike as a real-world data point about the actual limits of American deep strike capability, information that matters enormously to any country maintaining its own hardened underground military infrastructure anywhere in the world. Now, here's a detail that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it's honestly one of the more unsettling parts of this entire story. Reporting has since emerged suggesting that not every GBU-57 dropped during the earlier Fordow and Natanz strikes actually detonated as intended. Unexploded penetrators, potentially still lodged deep inside some of Iran's most sensitive former nuclear facilities, represent a strange and dangerous kind of unfinished business hanging over this entire conflict. Analysts have pointed out that this creates what they describe as a long-tail escalation risk, meaning that even after the shooting eventually stops, buried ordnance and suspended international inspections leave behind a kind of unresolved technical battlefield that could matter again years down the line, whether through accidental detonation, deliberate recovery and study by hostile actors, or simply the ongoing uncertainty about what condition these sites are actually left in. It's a reminder that even a weapon this powerful, this precisely engineered, doesn't guarantee a clean, fully resolved outcome every single time it's used, and that the physical aftermath of a strike like this can linger in ways that are much harder to track and control than the initial explosion itself. Chinese military analysts, watching all of this unfold from the outside, offered their own interesting read on the situation when the GBU-57 first made its combat debut last year, an assessment worth understanding because it comes from a country with real technical expertise in exactly this category of underground warfare. While acknowledging the success of the long-range B-2 mission and the raw performance of the bunker buster itself, they also specifically pointed out the weapon's limitations against sites built as deep as Fordow, noting that even America's most powerful conventional bomb still has real physical boundaries on what it can guarantee to destroy. That's a meaningful observation coming from a country widely believed to operate one of the most extensive underground bunker networks on the planet, and one that has reportedly been developing its own bunker-busting capabilities with an eye toward potential future targets of its own. When military analysts on the other side of the world are studying exactly how the GBU-57 performed against Iranian granite and reinforced concrete, it tells you this weapon's significance extends well beyond this one specific conflict. Every strike becomes a real-world data point in a much larger, ongoing global conversation about whether depth and hardened construction can still reliably protect a nation's most sensitive infrastructure in an era where weapons like this actually exist and have now been proven in combat multiple times over. So let's connect all of this back to where things stand right now, because the strike on that IRGC bunker near Tehran back in April wasn't the end of this story. It was really just one especially dramatic chapter in a much longer campaign that's continued escalating in the months since. The same doctrine that drove that strike, use overwhelming precision firepower to reach targets that were specifically built to be unreachable, has continued showing up again and again throughout this war. It showed up when Taleghan II got hit after months of visible hardening efforts. It's shown up in the ongoing debate over Pickaxe Mountain, the deeply buried facility near Natanz that remains, as of right now, the single most significant unstruck target of the entire conflict specifically, because its depth and geology raise real questions about whether even the GBU-57 can guarantee full destruction. And it's shown up in the broader pattern of this war, where Iran keeps building deeper and harder, and the United States keeps developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to prove that no amount of depth is actually enough. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with, though, because it would be easy to walk away from a story like this, assuming American air power can simply reach anything, anywhere, given enough time and enough bombs. That's not entirely accurate, and the details of these strikes actually show why. The GBU-57 has real physical limits on how much rock and concrete it can penetrate before losing the kinetic energy needed to detonate effectively at target depth. Sites like Fordow required massive, coordinated strikes with multiple bombs stacked on the same target, not a single clean shot. And the ongoing uncertainty about facilities like Pickaxe Mountain, potentially buried several times deeper than anything struck so far, shows that Iran's response to losing its shallower infrastructure has simply been to dig deeper still, betting that geology itself might eventually succeed where concrete and soil alone couldn't. This is genuinely an arms race playing out in real time between how deep a country can bury something and how far a bomb can reach to find it, and neither side has definitively won that contest yet. There's also the matter of verification, since even a strike widely reported as successful, like the one on that IRGC bunker near Tehran, still relies heavily on satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and secondhand intelligence rather than physical inspection on the ground. Battle damage assessment for a facility buried this deep is inherently difficult, and the gap between what officials describe as obliterated and what can actually be confirmed through independent verification remains one of the more persistent uncertainties hanging over almost every strike of this kind throughout the entire war. There's also something worth appreciating about the sheer physical demands this kind of mission places on the pilots actually flying it, because it's easy to focus entirely on the bomb and forget about the human beings responsible for delivering it precisely where it needs to go. A round trip from Whiteman Air Force Base to targets deep inside Iran covers something in the range of 7,000 miles each way, meaning crews are strapped into a two-person cockpit for well over a full day of continuous flight, refueling multiple times in midair, operating on a schedule that leaves almost no margin for error and very little opportunity for rest. These aren't routine training sorties. They're some of the longest and most physically demanding combat missions flown by any air force on the planet, and the fact that this specific mission also required a real-time course correction mid-flight, adjusting from a pre-planned route toward a newly identified time-sensitive target, adds an entirely different layer of difficulty on top of the physical endurance already required just to get the aircraft to the region and back safely. What the April strike near Tehran really demonstrated, though, wasn't just raw destructive power. It was operational flexibility under extreme pressure. This wasn't a pre-planned strike against a static target, scheduled weeks in advance with every variable accounted for. It was a dynamic, time-sensitive decision made in the middle of an active and dangerous rescue mission, executed by aircraft that had already been in the air for hours on a mission with an entirely different original purpose. That kind of adaptability, fusing real-time intelligence with strategic long-range bombers already airborne, represents a genuinely different level of military capability than simply having a powerful bomb sitting in a warehouse somewhere. It's the difference between owning a weapon and actually being able to employ it precisely, on short notice, under combat conditions, while simultaneously running a completely separate high-risk operation just miles away. For adversaries watching this war unfold from anywhere else in the world, that combination is arguably a more important lesson than the raw statistics of the bomb itself. And that's really what makes this specific story worth understanding in detail, beyond just the shock value of a 30,000-pound bomb obliterating an underground bunker. It tells you something concrete about the actual character of this war, that it's being fought with a level of precision, coordination, and real-time decision-making that goes well beyond simply flying overhead and dropping ordnance on a map coordinate. Every strike like this one carries information for the next one, about what worked, about how Iran responded and adapted afterward, about which targets still remain, and about how much deeper this whole contest can realistically go before physical geology itself starts setting the limits rather than political will or weapons technology. Iran has spent years and billions of dollars betting that depth alone equals safety. The GBU-57 exists specifically to test that bet strike by strike, and so far, every time that bet has actually been tested in combat, it's come up short. Whatever comes next in this war, whether it's a resolution at the negotiating table or another dramatic night like the one near Tehran back in April, the lesson embedded in that single strike isn't going away. There is, at least so far, no bunker deep enough to guarantee safety once American intelligence and American penetrating weapons are both pointed at the same coordinates. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Given everything this weapon has already proven capable of reaching, from Fordow and Natanz to a hardened command bunker buried near the heart of Tehran itself, do you think there's any facility left in Iran that's genuinely out of reach? Or is this really just a matter of time and intelligence gathering before every remaining hardened target eventually gets found and struck the same way, regardless of how much concrete or how many meters of solid rock stand between it and the surface? I'd really like to hear where you land on that in the comments below, because there are serious arguments on both sides of that question, especially once you start factoring in sites specifically built to be even deeper and tougher than anything hit so far. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what happened that night near Tehran and why it matters so much for the rest of this war, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed coverage reach more people trying to actually understand this conflict instead of just scrolling past another headline about an airstrike without ever learning the full story behind it. And if you want to be here for whatever comes next, because this campaign is clearly still moving, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Share this with anyone you know who's been hearing about bunker buster bombs in the news without really understanding what makes this specific weapon so different. Because once you know the full story behind it, from its origins in Operation Midnight Hammer to that dramatic night near Tehran in April, it completely changes how you look at every future headline about strikes on Iran. And it makes every satellite image of a reinforced mountainside or a freshly poured concrete shell mean something very different than it did before. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.